Hello everyone, welcome to A Bit Lit. Thank you very much for joining me today to talk about reading in the 21st century. I'm going to start by asking you all to introduce yourselves. So Brooke, could you start us off please?
Hello everyone, I'm Brooke. I teach in the English department at Chaminade University. I teach and have a PhD in early modern English literature and Shakespeare, but I teach rhetoric and composition, literature surveys and Shakespeare. And Chaminade is a teaching university, so teaching is really what we do.
Wonderful, thank you. And Dustyn, could you introduce yourself now, please?
Aloha, my name is Dustyn Kainoa Ragasa. I'm in philosophy and religion. This semester, I'm teaching 2 courses in ethics and 1 seminar, graduate seminar in theological anthropology.
Great, thank you. And Liza, could you tell us about you, please?
Aloha, I'm Liza Lockard. I'm an associate professor at Chaminade University in the Environmental and Interior Design program. I have my master's in architecture and a PhD in future studies, and specifically with my research focuses on human habitation in space. And I teach a number of different design courses at Chaminade now from freshman to senior level.
Great, thank you everyone. Well, this is a really excitingly interdisciplinary group to be talking about reading practices with. So I'll maybe just ask you each to say a bit more about how reading practices speak to your research interests, or what you think and feel about reading in the 21st century. So again, maybe Brooke, because you had the great idea of bringing everyone together to discuss this, could you start us off?
Sure, mahalo. I was really excited when I first saw Andy Kessens, and I think the 3 of you were talking about the bit lit and the pandemic and reading and what it means to be confined to home and screens and all that kind of stuff. And so I thought, wow, what a great platform and what a great idea. And for me in the English department, really our field is about the written word and texts and literature. And so right away, I think reading is already central to what I do, but there are a couple kinds of reading. There's the reading for pleasure, and that's the reading that really got me to where I am. For many of us in literature fields, you know, we love reading, and we're able to pick up a book and take these words and imagine them, and they're words that have been created and written by someone else. But when we put them together and use our imagination to create a scape, a world, we're able to escape the world. And engage in another world that's been created by someone else, but only comes to life when we engage it, when we read those words. And so there's a love of literature and a pleasure in reading that really has driven me to where I am in the field and in teaching. How I read for teaching is really quite different, but I can remember back in graduate school being sort of struck by the people who started to complain about having too much reading, or reading literary criticism, for example, and saying that they were losing their love of reading and all of that sort of thing. And I thought, well, that's seemingly different to my experience, because always, regardless of the kind, I'm very engaged in this idea that I can pick up a thing, start reading these words and have these thoughts and go to a different space and place. It is in many ways a kind of thinking and cognitive space, but it also has some other components to it. For example, with books, you know, I like books because I like the fact that they're material objects. They have spines and covers and pages and smells and feels and weights and all those things. And so when I pick one up and I have that experience, something really kind of wild happens. Of course, I was thinking about this in our discussion in the pandemic in the 21st century. And, you know, now I can read via screen. I can hear a book read to me via something like Audible. And I haven't really done that, but that's a thing that's quite common, I think. But I can read on a screen and via Kindle or different, you know, whatever app you use or whatever thing you use. I can read, I can highlight, I can scroll, I can touch, I can look up words, I can do different things in a digital way, reading, that make for a different kind of experience. And so that, I think, is really important. I tend to read for pleasure on a Kindle sometimes, but I still tend to prefer the book and the commodity, the material object, the thing, when I read at any point. But as a scholar and researcher, I also like to mark on things and write on them and create marginalia and do all of that sort of thing, which again lends itself to a material object rather than a screen, which is different. But I'm thinking about our space in A Bit Lit and the way by which why so many of us have been forced to go back to screens and find some solace, some pleasure, some escape, some release in those screens, and I think largely in reading.
Thank you. I think that's really fascinating, because the first thing that you mentioned about just the pleasure and the enjoyment that comes in reading, and the way that maybe for some people at least academic discourses can sort of distance us from that, or taking part in academia as a process can distance us from it. The thing that's really struck me about doing a bit lit videos is, you know, many of us are in some ways literary professionals, but the things we choose to talk about are the things that make us excited and happy, and we're taking that pleasure in reading. And it's really nice to sometimes rediscover that vocabulary. I feel like in a university context, sometimes pleasure is lost from the conversation, and that maybe links to that, what you're saying about the tactility, the materiality, the sensory aspects of books. And I notice you're very balanced in the way that you also pull out the interactivity of ebooks and the way that they have different pleasures. And maybe something we can pick up on a bit is how that links to, as you touched on, the idea in the pandemic of many of our kind of sensory or tactile interactions with things having to become digital. But maybe we could hear a bit from Dustyn now about how does that speak to your experience of reading and your way of thinking about reading?
Yes, on a certain level it does. You know, like Brooke, I really do enjoy the tactile feeling of opening up a good paper book, writing marginalia. I have this whole collection of pencils I'm ashamed to admit that I use just for writing in books, you know, because certain papers react to certain leads in certain ways, and I dig that. The process of reading for me is always a little less about I don't want to mean to say exactly as escape as Brooke says, but as an ethicist. So let me back up a bit. My field is ethics. I studied this thing called virtue ethics or aretaic ethics, depending on where you're from in the world. One of the things that we talk about in that field is that every experience you have is somehow formative, whether it be the people you talk to, the things that happen to you on a daily basis in your life, but also the act of reading. And so for me to open up a book is to be open to being formed somehow. And this is, of course, an enjoyable and pleasurable experience, but it's one of those things where everything one reads, I believe, in some way, shape, or form, is formative. It helps develop us as human beings, our basic human capacities for empathy, for compassion, our eye for justice, our sense of goodness. So when I think about reading, I really think about the formative element. The other thing that I love about reading is that texts have formed a sort of body of shared points of reference. A lot of the authors we read in my field, and certainly yours, happen to have lived at certain times or places. They have not intersected in time and space. But that occurs in the process of reading as we appropriate, internalize what is being said. Those conversations occur in a certain way within us ourselves, which is an enjoyable experience. And it's a novelty of those types of ongoing conversations within the mind of the reader that I think is just a really wonderful and fascinating sort of thing.
Wow, thank you. I feel I'd thought about some of those things in very wishy-washy terms before, but it's wonderful to have them expressed properly by an ethicist. The idea that, that books are forming us, which I feel emotionally, but it's interesting to think about it as a kind of philosophical act. And it's intriguing how I feel like for the first time ever, I've been using a lot of vocabulary of the synchronous and the asynchronous recently when thinking about online teaching that I've never had to think about before. And it sounds almost as if you're saying that reading is asynchronous virtual communication because of what you say about it being disembodied and out of time and out of space, which is really fascinating. I'm going to ask a very speedy follow-up question, if I may, before we move on, because I was interested when you said that you feel like I think you used the phrase every book is forming us. So do you make a distinction there between the literary and the non-literary? Do you think there are genres of kind of popular fiction that don't have the same role? Or do you think it's true of all fiction or non-fiction as well? Is there kind of a category around which you draw the line there in terms of books as formation?
I actually think all books are somehow formative, whether if you read a work of nonfiction, it might present to you an understanding or a notion of love, what love is, what it means to be a friend. I mean, it's one of those things. And of course, the person is free to appropriate that or not. But I think everything presents to us something that could be tucked into a repertoire of responses, dispositions, or ways of thinking about the world.
Wonderful, thank you. I really like that. I never like the kind of parceling off only this counts as literature and gets to have that role. Yeah, that's a really exciting way of reading it. Wonderful. Well, Liza, could we move on to you now? Could you tell us how you think about reading and how that maybe speaks to what's been said already?
Okay. It's a little bit ironic that I'm invited to this group as a designer because our field generally is not known to be big readers. And when Brooke asked me to join this discussion, I was really kind of perplexed as to how to really uncover for me what that relationship is between what I do as a designer and my love of reading. And I have to admit, I've always seen those as kind of bifurcated, that I didn't really feel that there was an integral relationship between the two. But to speak to a point that Dustyn made earlier, design is the process of synthesis. We're creating spaces that will be used by people. And we can't create things in a vacuum. We can't synthesize without having some foundation first. And so the more well-read myself or our students are, the greater capacity we have for empathy, for understanding the world, for being able to imagine things abstractly that we can then translate through our particular medium. And so I had not really realized that about myself and about my process. So it was really kind of a revelation for me to learn that. I also, because design, I think, is primarily sensory field, and I think of reading as more cognitive, I also did not see that relationship between the two. And like Dustyn and Brooke, and I think maybe this is very old school of us to say this, but it's interesting hearing this from Dustyn because I think he's a very different generation from at least myself, that the joy of reading came in the kind of tactile sensory aspects of the book, and even the way the book smelled and the feeling of the paper and all of that. It was just as enjoyable to me as the cognitive aspects, the engagement of reading. I don't feel the same way about online platforms and reading on Kindles. I've lost some of that, but I would not project that bias onto people of a different generation, especially in particular our students, because what we found enjoyable, the way I came into reading, might be very different than this generation, where it might be picking up the iPad and the act of scrolling is the kind of sensory satisfaction they get in that. It's just not for me. And what's another point that I'd like to bring up is that I was dyslexic growing up, and so reading was especially difficult for me. I couldn't read my first book until I was about 18 or 19, and it wasn't because I was not literate. It was a struggle to actually read. And I will admit, this is a bit of a confession. The only way I could get into reading was by reading the kind of dime store novels that you find at a pharmacy or bookstore on those racks. But it allowed me to learn how to read, and so I needed to learn how to read and develop that facility because it was extremely laborious for me. Now I absolutely love it, and ironically, I became a philosophy major shortly thereafter, and people would always ask, how do you become a philosophy major if you're dyslexic, if it takes you so long to read? And I would argue that reading, and I think this is a bias that we have about reading, is that you have to read, voluminous amounts of work, and that you have to be able to read fast. And it took me a while to break away from that bias and to recognize that you can savor something. You can do it very slowly and just really savor it. And so reading then switched from being something that was laborious and tedious and challenging for me to something I could really savor and enjoy.
Wow, that's amazing, because I feel like there's been such an emphasis over the years on sort of speed reading courses, or how you kind of read things more quickly to sort of take in as much as possible. But I wonder if I don't know if this is a movement already, maybe it is, but I feel like slow reading could be a sort of complement to, slow food or slow scholarship of what you're saying, actually take the time to savor something and take it in. And I mean, attempted to read relatively little philosophy, but from my experience, you sort of have to read that slowly anyway, right? Because it's the amount of leaps you have to take with every few words that I can see that would be particularly well suited to that. But yeah, just to pick up on the other thing you were saying about ebooks and the kind of tactile pleasures of the page. It's interesting because I feel like a few years ago I remember my dad's an app developer, and he was very pro the idea that books were dying except as a rare luxury product. It was all going to be ebooks. And there was an article in The Economist where they had these graphs of book sales and ebook sales, etc. But from what I've seen over the past years, the decline has stabilized. Ebook sales have dropped slightly. There have been more print books. So it seems that wasn't a narrative that we might expect, either a generational narrative or a progress narrative. So there seems to be something that's offered by both, or something that's potentially complementary there, which is really interesting. And I'll maybe come back to that in a second. But the final thing I wanted to say, to touch on what you were saying, Liza, was the idea of imagination kind of being fed by books in order to put design in practice, or I can't remember the exact phrase you used, something like in order to have a space for design, or in order to set up the world of imagination out of which you would design. I really love that idea, that's that sort of multi-stage process that the books are feeding into. Does anyone have anything they want to say, jumping off anything I've already said, before I ask another question and set us going again?
I just wanted to jump in. I think, Dustyn?
No, after you, Brooke. Go for it.
Okay. I love this idea that the contrast or the conflict maybe between say quantity and quality, and say surface and depth, right? That for me, one of the benefits of the material tactile thing is that when I read through a book, I can see all those pages and I can see my progress in ways that I can't on a screen, because there's a percentage that they offer, like, oh, you've read 74%. But I'm a reader, and things like quantitative data and 74% don't really register in the same way that bookmark in a book does. That bookmark at the beginning, and then over time, at the end. And then the weight of, I read all those pages. Like there's a certain amount of success and pleasure in that consumption, I suppose. And consumption I use with kind of caution, because it's capitalist driven. But one of the critiques that oftentimes people make about reading and life in the 21st century today is that people don't read anymore. And I think that's a dangerous comment, because in fact, when we're on those machines, we're reading all the time, but we're not necessarily reading Milton's Paradise Lost, right? We're reading 97,000 texts from our friends, and we're reading all our Snapchats and, all our Instagrams and all this stuff that is visual and textual in different ways. And it's transforming us in that process, but we are reading. Central to that is the reading process. So it's different than what it's been like in the past, but it's still reading regardless.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I suppose there's a tendency to bracket kind of books and reading books as sort of wholesome and virtuous, and then reading online as sort of dangerous and bitty and feeding your attention. But then you can get long reads online, and where do you put dime store novels in that kind of shift? Are you dividing by genre? And I know that people used to think that in the 18th century that the novel was dangerous, and then it was magazines, and now maybe a magazine looks wholesome because it's a real thing with pages, and it's not just frittering your attention on the internet. So that's really interesting about the different kinds of reading. And Dustyn, what were you going to say? Does it speak to that, or was it a separate idea?
Related, something that Liza said, about a generation. So I am a millennial, and a lot of my reality, especially in the COVID-19 period that we find ourselves in, is mediated by a screen. And I think one of the things that I really appreciate about picking up a book is that it's something other than a screen, just for this particular circumstance. But I think a lot of people my age right now are looking for quote unquote analog experiences. What does it mean to disconnect from electronic media? What does it mean to pick something up? You see the explosion of LPs, which I think is an interesting phenomenon. People aren't using CDs or cassette tapes, but LPs, actual LPs. People are writing again on pieces of paper. So it's just one of those things where, yes, I too recognize the value, and certainly things work differently for other people. But I think there's a bunch of us that really like the sensory tactile experience that a screen just cannot provide, and also just trying to get away from screens for a few hours of the day is pretty nice. But,
yeah. Completely. I mean, yeah, as another millennial, I definitely feel what you mean. I feel even before this, my screen was so much my window onto the world, and now it's even more so. So there is that joy of just stepping away from it and escaping it. And that actually beautifully prefigures the next question I was going to ask, which was just, has anyone's reading practice been changed over the last few weeks in the new circumstance we find ourselves in? Has that affected how you read or what you read? And maybe, Liza, because we haven't heard from you most recently, I'll leap to you first.
Okay. Yeah, so the first thing, as soon as I found out that we were going to the lockdown, rather than going out and hoarding toilet paper and sanitizer, I made sure that I had a good stockpile of books I could read. And now it's interesting. I think there will be a resurgence in reading. I could be wrong about this, but because the computer and social platforms were always a way to kind of escape our daily world. And now it comprises our daily world completely, that there's going to be a longing that books will now be escaped from that, right? And that it will kind of supplant the kind of things that we used to use to escape our daily realities and the kind of banal pedestrian activities that we use books and other social platforms for. We are kind of now trapped, and I'm going to put it this way. I mean, I understand that there's a kind of empowering aspect of social media, but now because this social media is the only platform that we have to communicate with each other, to have any kind of life, that books now will be the kind of thing that we can use to get away from that. Mm-hmm. And so I have my pile of books here, and I've read more than I have probably in years in the last couple of weeks.
That's lovely. So there's a sort of a joy to the lockdown. I love the idea of hoarding books in advance. I wish I'd done that, but to be honest, I've got so many books on these shelves that I keep buying new books and not reading, that now I'm like, right, finally I will sit down and read my books. So I'm choosing that path instead. Brooke and Dustyn, do you have any thoughts on how it's changing your reading practices?
Yeah, I love that Liza, the reader, was grabbing books instead of toilet paper. That's a fabulous story in the face of crisis and the current apocalypse. But you know, I didn't do that. I didn't do the same thing. I didn't go to the library or to the bookstore. But I did sort of what you mentioned, Emma, that I have some books around. Like I've got this old Stephen King book about John F. Kennedy's assassination, and it's a big, huge, thick book, you know, in sort of traditional Stephen King ways. And when do I have time to read Stephen King today? You know, I don't ever. So I had to dig down and grab that and pull that book off the shelf and say, I need to read that. The other thing is on my Kindle, I have some texts that I just haven't jumped into. And part of that speaks to that divide. Like I've been reading, because I've given my son those Timothy Zahn, Thrawn trilogy Star Wars novels. I've put those onto my Kindle and I'm reading those things on my Kindle, which is holy pleasure, right? That's just consumption. But I've also got some interesting texts in there. I've got Fred Moten's In the Break, which is really about subjectivity and blackness and race and Shakespeare. And I've got Madeline Mills' Circe, I think, which is feminist reconstruction of Circe. And,
yeah,
and those are, oh, do you? Yeah, I just started it and it's fascinating. But so those are, you know, those are both for pleasure and for work. Those are both spaces where I've said, okay, these have sat on my Kindle for a while. Now's the time to go ahead and engage and do that. And so that's changed my practice. It's opened it a little bit more. I think the biggest thing is this idea that now that we have some more time, that just like Liza said, I think I've got an opportunity to read more. And that I think is a real gift. That I think is a real gift for the reason of this entire conversation, I think, you know, what reading brings us. I just want to say one last thing, and that is that I was thinking about this when Liza was talking before, maybe, and that's the idea of that hyperlink and the rich text. And what's tricky to me about rich text is that, and I too may be old school, Gen X here, but the breakage of genres that happens through a hyperlink or a rich text touch, right? Once I click on this and I go somewhere else, that means that I'm no longer in the thing. And for me, that gets really unsettling because I'm going down the rabbit hole, right? That suddenly I'm 5 clicks off and I'm in a whole new world, which is different from epic poetry and what it might mean to have to choose to be evil. how do I ever get back to that? You know what I mean? Through those clicks, or can I, when I read in that way? That's a little scary for me.
Absolutely.
And I was reminded of that. And my fear, I think, comes back to that question of genre, that's the fear for me with rich text, is that I might lose myself and lose the whole thing in the process.
And that's really interesting, because I suppose that was reminding me of what we were saying earlier about consumption and the way, you know, is it consuming a text as you go through it? But the delightful thing about, you know, a book is that a kind of physical book is that it's like having your cake and eating it. You consume it and it's still there. You can start again. And I feel like even on Kindle, it sorts your books into read and unread. And I'm a real rereader. And so I struggle with that, because it's sort of saying, what, these are obsolete now because I've read them. And you're right with the hyperlink text. You don't even have the first text. You've left it. You've gone. You've moved away, which is a really sort of troubling thing. But yeah, I can totally empathize with the Stephen King reading as well, because I feel that's they're the sorts of stories you want to read all the way through at once in one big gulp, and you can't often do that in a working life. And that's one thing that gives us an opportunity now. And Dustyn, did you have any thoughts? I know you touched slightly on the change to reading practices in pandemic earlier, but do you have more you want to say about that?
Yes, I mean, like what we're talking about, I think the slow reading has been something that I am recovering. You know, it's one of those things when you're in graduate studies, you need to read slowly. And these days we don't have time to do it. But it's one of those things where it's almost a ritual, isn't it? You just sit there and you set aside some time and you just deliberately do something. And I love that. This kind of goes into teaching a little bit, but one of the things that I've come to realize about this moment is that I actually saw a meme on this. The meme was, what did we even talk about before COVID-19? And I actually wondered, you know, what did we talk about before COVID-19? And so now that everybody is in their little bunker and kind of off in their own little world, I think, again, having texts as common points of reference between people across the world, especially my students, who many of them are afraid, many of them are disoriented, you know, many of them feel alone. And so the fact that we can go through texts weekly and have these as stable points of reference where we can talk about something other than our situation, or something other than a Tiger King or Witcher or something. You know, it's something that I really appreciate, and I hope they see the value in that, because there's still a whole world full of meaning other than, again, our circumstance. Yeah, reading has been changed, and I think in many ways enhanced by our circumstances.
And that's lovely. That's sort of a really hopeful call to reading, and to the idea of reading having this especially important role to play sort of in the current times, as both something you can do to escape, but also something you can do to connect. And as you say, to form a topic of conversation as well, which is an important thing when you're mainly just talking about the virus. And I like that you came back to slow reading again there, because I suppose that's speaking to what Liza was saying about, I don't think we touched on it properly yet, but I found it a really, really interesting and hopeful thing that you said that your dyslexia was what made you read more slowly, but that the discovery that the slow reading in itself has a whole value that would be lost if you were kind of plowing through these texts. I could keep asking you more questions and just talking about all of this all evening or all morning for you, but I feel I should probably start to wrap things up, because I want to give us all time to properly answer my last question, which is of course the question that all the BitLit videos have been ending with, which is, what is literature? And I wonder if, I feel we've been sort of skirting around this the whole conversation anyway, but if there's anything you'd like to pull out about what you feel literature is, maybe we could go back to the order in which we all introduced ourselves. So Brooke, then Dustyn, then Liza, if that works for everyone. So Brooke, could you start us off?
Certainly. It's been wonderful to talk, and mahalo all of you for engaging in this conversation that I thought of a while back, you know, when Andy first offered the pitch. And it's beautiful to be here with you and to have this conversation about this thing, reading and literature. And so for me, literature is the entryway. It's the portal, it's the door. And as we can see via our different fields, it looks different in different spaces, and it feels different, and it does different things, absolutely. But what it does, above all else, is allow me entry into the human imagination and world and new ways of being.
That's beautiful. Thank you. Wonderful. And Dustyn, over to you.
So again, literature is not per se my field, and I thought about this a bit. And the way I think about literature is it's a structure of meaning mediated by symbol. And what I mean by that is that the body of texts we might refer to as literature points beyond itself towards some broader category. It's a transcendent sort of experience. And we tend to celebrate some certain texts for their ability to do that. But again, I think a literature does not leave you stranded on a page. It doesn't leave you stranded on a screen, but invites you to go somewhere other than what you immediately see in front of you.
Thank you. Gosh, I feel I'm going to have to save all these answers. So next time someone asks me, what's the point of humanities? I can just sort of replay all of these. It says it so beautifully. Okay, and Liza, could you tell us what your response to that question is?
Okay. I have to say this is a bit of an intimidating question, again, coming from my background as a designer and talking to people who I think are more properly embedded in that field to answer this. But and so I thought, fundamentally, what is it? You know, how does it differ from design? And the medium is textual as opposed to spatio-visio or sensory. But I would get back to the comment that I was making earlier about that it has to be something that has to be savored, and there's that act of savoring something that differentiates it from the things that Brooke was referring to before. You know, we have lots of students who are really resistant to reading real books. And like you said, there's lots of reading going on through tweets and Instagram and all that. But that's like what I consider reading with a little R, not reading with a big R. And
I love that.
Big R. Because those don't impact our life in any meaningful ways. I think they don't give us things to think about. They don't make us feel, or maybe they do make us feel smaller, but not in the way that helps us to grow. And so I think literature does that for us. It's, as Dustyn was mentioning, it's something that's transcendental by its nature. And I know that might be an evasive answer, but that's how I would distinguish literature from all the other types of reading that we do.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a lovely, really rich answer. And thank you also for your willingness to talk outside your discipline. Thank you to both you and Dustyn for that, because I know it's, as a literature person, I'm terrified the minute I dip a toe outside into art history or something, I just want to run away. So it's really generous of you, and I appreciate it. And I'm sorry to say we'll have to call it to a close there, but thank you so much, everyone, for this really fascinating conversation. And yeah, thank you for your beautiful ways of expressing just how much reading means to all of us in this sort of time when it's one of the few things we can do to escape.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you very much for hosting us today.